Welcome back to the final session of the research questions and hypothesis formulation topic. So here we are going to focus on the null hypothesis. When you have your testable research question and you have converted it to hypothesis, before you can do your statistical testing, you must convert the hypothesis to the null hypothesis, because you cannot test the alternative hypothesis. You can only test the null hypothesis. So you formulate the null hypothesis by adding the word no or not to the previous hypothesis that was stated. So if you have, for example, there is statistically significant relationship between the location of respondents' house and their perception of municipal waste management in Choba, then your null hypothesis that you are going to subject to statistical testing will be: there is no statistically significant relationship between the location of respondents' house and their perception of municipal waste management in Choba. That will be the null hypothesis. Remember, once again, the alternative hypothesis is there is statistically significant relationship between the location of respondents' house and their perception of municipal waste management in Choba. The null hypothesis will be there is no statistically significant relationship between the location of respondents' house and their perception of municipal waste management in Choba. So the null hypothesis is what we're going to subject to statistical testing, because in scientific inquiry we assume that it is better to be unbiased. We assume from the onset that there is no. So we need to find evidence to convince us that there is. So we don't start with there is. We start with there is no. So we must look for evidence in form of statistical evidence to tell us that there is no. There is, rather. So remember, scientific inquiry starts with the null hypothesis. When we are testing hypothesis, we test the null hypothesis. So we want to find out whether we are going to retain the null hypothesis, which states that there is no, or we are going to retain the alternative hypothesis, which states that there is. So we don't start with the bias and go and test the bias that there is. We always test to find out whether we are going to retain the null hypothesis or we are going to reject the null hypothesis. That is how the scientific inquiry works. That is how hypothesis testing works. You test the null hypothesis. You cannot test the alternative hypothesis. You don't test the hypothesis directly. You convert it to null hypothesis before you can test it. Remember, the null hypothesis says there is no, while the alternative hypothesis states that there is. So in your chapter 1, you start with there is, but when you get to your chapter 3, when you are writing your methodology and you are stating your statistical techniques and your hypothesis, you are going to state the null hypothesis. But in chapter 1, where you are introducing the work and you are talking about your research question and hypothesis, you are going to state the alternative hypothesis. So remember what I stated earlier, you test the null hypothesis. So you carry out the statistical testing on the null hypothesis, not on the alternative hypothesis. When we do statistical testing, there are two things that could be the outcome. Two decisions we could make. It's either we reject the null hypothesis, which means there is so association or relationship or difference. When we reject, if we reject the null hypothesis, then we are going to retain the alternative hypothesis. The alternative decision we could make, the second decision we could make, is we can fail to reject or retain the null hypothesis. If we fail to reject or we retain the null hypothesis, it means that we are rejecting the alternative hypothesis. Let me go over that again. If we reject the null hypothesis, then we are going to retain the alternative hypothesis. The null says there is no, the alternative said there is. So if we reject the null, which states that there is no, then we are going to retain the alternative hypothesis, which states that there is. The second decision we could make, which is the alternative decision that we could make, is we can reject, or we can retain rather, we can retain the null hypothesis. If we retain the null hypothesis, it means that we are rejecting the alternative hypothesis. So which means we are saying that there is actually no relationship or association or difference. So we are rejecting the hypothesis which says there is. So remember, I've seen this in some literature, and it is a very bad practice. We do not say we are accepting null hypothesis. Never say accept. We either reject or we retain. Because in science, there is evolution of knowledge. When we find out new things, we reject previous findings, because now we have new knowledge. We don't use the statement, the word accept, because accept has a kind of finality to it. We don't use accept. Never use accept when you are relating to your hypothesis after your statistical testing. Remember, tests only assess whether available evidence exists to reject the null hypothesis. That is one of the reasons why we don't say accept, because we are holding on to the result based on the evidence that we have now. If new evidence surfaces, then we reject the old findings and we retain the new findings. If later new findings surfaces again, we will reject the old ones and hold on to the new ones, and so on. That is how scientific knowledge is developed. We don't hold on to something and accept as final until, because we know that in the future new techniques, new findings might show us that what we are holding on to may not be correct. So we reject or retain, because those are tentative in the way they are casted. So we have come to the end of this particular topic now. You should be able to explain the relationship between research questions and hypotheses. You should be able to state valid research questions, either testable or non-testable, and you should be able to convert the testable research question to hypothesis. So if you can answer all of these, then you are well and good in understanding all the concepts and facts and understanding that have been presented during this session. Thank you for taking part and take care.